My name is Clara, and I'm 77 years old. I'm sitting here in the living room of my beautiful Victorian home that now belongs entirely to me, and I can't help but smile a little when I think about how people always say that after 55 years of marriage, there are no more surprises left. Well, they're wrong. Sometimes the biggest surprise comes when the person you've trusted most decides to walk away for what he calls happiness. But here's the thing about surprises. They can work both ways. Before I tell you about how I turned what seemed like my greatest failure into my most satisfying victory, let me know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button if you believe that after every storm, there's always a rainbow waiting, and don't forget to subscribe because trust me, you'll want to hear how this story ends. It was 1968 when I first met Harold at a dance hall on the south side of Chicago. I was just 18, fresh out of high school, wearing my best blue dress, and feeling like the world was full of endless possibilities. Harold was 20, tall and lean with dark hair that he kept perfectly combed and the warmest brown eyes I'd ever seen. He asked me to dance to Can't Help Myself by the Four Tops, and I swear I fell in love right there on that crowded floor. Our first real date was at the drive-in theater where we watched Funny Girl while sharing a bucket of popcorn and root beer floats. Harold was studying engineering at the University of Illinois, working part-time at a garage to pay his tuition. I was working as a secretary at an insurance office, saving every penny I could for my future. We'd spend hours talking about our dreams, his plans to start his own engineering firm someday, my hopes of becoming a teacher and making a difference in children's lives. 2 years later, on a crisp October evening in 1970, Harold proposed to me with a small diamond ring that he'd been saving for months to buy. It wasn't much by today's standards, but it was everything to me. "Clara," he said, getting down on one knee right there in Lincoln Park, "I want to build a life with you. I want us to grow old together and watch our grandchildren play in a house that we've made into a home." We had a small wedding at St. Mary's Church in June of 1971. My mother made my dress, Harold's father was his best man, and we honeymooned for 3 days at a little cabin in Wisconsin. We couldn't afford much, but we were rich in love and determination. We rented a tiny studio apartment where we shared everything: dreams, responsibilities, and a belief that together we could accomplish anything. Within 2 years, we'd saved enough for a down payment on our first house using an FHA loan. It was a modest 2-bedroom bungalow with a small yard, but Harold planted roses along the front fence, and I painted every room in bright, cheerful colors. David arrived in 1973, followed by Susan in 1976. Those early years were a beautiful blur of midnight feedings, first steps, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. Harold worked long hours at Morrison Engineering, while I taught 3rd grade at Jefferson Elementary. Every evening, he'd come home exhausted but always with energy for the children. We'd sit around our small kitchen table, sharing our days and planning our future. Saturday mornings were for pancakes and cartoons, Sunday afternoons for family walks and working in the garden together. We saved every extra dollar, invested wisely, and by 1982, Harold had enough capital and experience to start Sterling Engineering Solutions. Those next 15 years were when we really built our wealth and our life together. Harold's company grew from a one-man operation in our basement to a thriving firm with 12 employees. I became the principal at Lincoln Elementary School, and together we navigated the challenges of raising teenagers while building our careers. We bought the Victorian house in 1987, 5 bedrooms, wraparound porch, and enough space for our family to spread out and grow. When Harold's parents became ill in the early 90s, we brought them into our home for their final 5 years. It wasn't easy, but we managed the care together. Me handling the daily needs, Harold managing their medical appointments and financial affairs. During this time, we also made our first real estate investments, purchasing 2 rental properties that would provide steady income for decades to come. By 2000, our children were established in their own careers and starting families. Harold and I began to talk seriously about retirement. We opened joint savings accounts, made sure all our assets were titled jointly, and plan for a future where we travel and enjoy the fruits of our 5 decades of hard work. Everything we owned together. Everything we'd built as a team. The first signs that something was changing came so gradually that I almost missed them entirely. It started in early 2020 when Harold began staying late at the office more frequently than usual. "We're expanding the business for the retirement transition," he'd explain when he'd come home after 9 o'clock, loosening his tie and heading straight for the shower. At 72, Harold was supposedly winding down, but his schedule suggested otherwise. I noticed he'd started placing his phone face down on the counter and keeping it in his pocket rather than leaving it on the kitchen table like he had for years. When it rang, he'd glance at the screen and either answer while walking to another room or let it go to voicemail. "Just business calls," he'd say with a wave of his hand. "Nothing that can't wait until morning." Then came the changes to his appearance. Harold had always been a practical man who bought his clothes at Sears and got his hair cut at the same barbershop for 30 years. Suddenly, he was shopping at department stores, buying expensive cologne, and visiting a trendy salon downtown. He joined a gym and started lifting weights, something he'd never shown interest in before. "I need to stay competitive in business, Clara," he'd say when I commented on his new wardrobe. "Image matters more than it used to." The weekend meetings became more frequent. Harold had always been dedicated to his work, but Saturdays had been our time, grocery shopping together, working in the garden, visiting the grandchildren. Now, more often than not, he'd announce on Friday evening that he had important client meetings or project deadlines that required weekend attention. "This expansion is crucial for our retirement security," he'd explain, gathering his briefcase and laptop. "I'm doing this for us." Our beautiful rose garden, which Harold had tended with such pride for decades, began to show signs of neglect. The roses we'd planted for each grandchild's birth were becoming overgrown, and weeds were sprouting between the carefully laid stones of the path he'd built. When I mentioned it, Harold just shrugged. "I'll get to it next weekend," became his standard response, but next weekend never came. For the first time in our marriage, Harold started declining social events that we'd always attended together. The annual church picnic that we'd never missed in 50 years suddenly conflicted with a crucial business meeting. The neighborhood barbecues where Harold used to hold court with stories about the old days were now inconvenient interruptions to his busy schedule. I felt like I was losing my husband to his work, but I trusted his explanations and tried to be supportive. One evening in late summer, I discovered he'd changed the Wi-Fi password without mentioning it to me. When I asked about it, he seemed surprised that I'd noticed. "Oh, that. The company's IT guy said we should update our security regularly. I thought I'd told you." He gave me the new password, but something about the way he avoided my eyes made me feel uneasy in a way I couldn't quite explain. The phone calls increased in frequency and secrecy. Harold would answer his cell phone and immediately step outside to the back deck or into his home office, closing the door behind him. When I asked who had called, he'd give vague answers about suppliers or potential clients. The conversation seemed to energize him in a way that business calls never had before. The morning that changed everything was March 15th, 2023. Harold had rushed out for what he called an emergency meeting with a potential client, and in his haste, he left his iPhone on the kitchen counter next to his coffee mug. I was clearing breakfast dishes when the screen lit up with a text message notification. The sender was listed simply as M, and the preview showed enough to stop my heart. "Can't wait for our Cabo trip next month." My hands were trembling as I picked up the phone. Harold had never set a passcode. What do I have to hide after all these years, he'd always joked. The message thread revealed a conversation that shattered 52 years of trust in an instant. "You deserve happiness after all these years," one message read. "She never appreciated you like I do," said another. "The kids are grown, Harold. It's time to live your life." I scrolled through weeks of messages, each one cutting deeper than the last. Her name was Melody. She was 38 years old, the human resources manager at Harold's company. The photos she'd sent showed a petite blonde woman with a bright smile, often posed in restaurants I recognized as places Harold had claimed to be having business dinners. The intimacy in their exchanges was unmistakable. Inside jokes, heart emojis, discussions about future plans that clearly didn't include me. The messages revealed a relationship that had been building for months. Melody talked about Harold's unhappy home life, how he deserved someone who understood his ambitions and appreciated his success. Harold responded with complaints about our marriage that I'd never heard him voice directly to me. She's lost interest in everything he'd written. All she cares about is her garden and her book club friends. I feel like I'm living with a stranger. That afternoon, while Harold was at his client meeting, I drove to the bank and requested copies of our statements for the past year. The evidence was all there in black and white. Weekly cash withdrawals of $300 to $500 labeled at business expenses charges at downtown hotels on days when Harold claimed to be in meetings, and travel expenses to destinations that matched the romantic getaways Melody had referenced in their messages. I created a folder on my computer and began documenting everything. Screenshots of Harold's social media activity showed him tagged at expensive restaurants with business associates who, based on the photos, were clearly couples enjoying romantic evenings. Melody's Instagram account, which wasn't set to private, featured photos from trips to Cabo, Las Vegas, and Miami, all places Harold had told me he'd visited for work conferences. The most devastating discovery came when I accessed Harold's email account using the password he'd been using for everything for 20 years. In his drafts folder, I found an unsent email to a divorce attorney. After 55 years of marriage, it read, "My wife and I have grown apart due to irreconcilable differences. She has become complacent and has lost interest in maintaining our relationship or supporting my professional goals." The proposed settlement outlined in his notes would leave me with modest alimony and a small cash settlement, while Harold retained the business, our home, and most of our retirement accounts. He'd calculated that I could live comfortably on $1,500 a month, plus whatever I could get for my teacher's pension. Meanwhile, he planned to maintain his current lifestyle and start fresh in Florida with Melody. Reading those emails felt like watching someone plan my funeral while I was still alive. The man I'd loved and supported for over half a century was plotting to discard me like an outdated piece of furniture, keeping everything we'd built together for himself and his young girlfriend. The next morning, I called Victoria Sterling, the most respected divorce attorney in our county. Her office was in a gleaming downtown building, and she received me in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Victoria was probably 50, impeccably dressed with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Mrs. Clara, she said, after I'd explained my situation, "You've come to me at exactly the right time. Illinois is a community property state, which means that all assets acquired during your marriage belong equally to both spouses, regardless of whose name is on the title." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Your husband's business was built with marital funds and your support, cooking his meals, managing his household, raising his children while he focused on growing his company. You're entitled to half of everything." Victoria explained how adultery could affect spousal support determinations and walked me through the process of documenting Harold's affair and his attempts to hide assets. "The fact that he's planning to leave you with minimal support while keeping the bulk of your marital property shows clear intent to defraud you of your rights," she said. "We can use that to our advantage." She outlined a strategy that would protect my interests while Harold remained unaware of my knowledge. First, we needed comprehensive documentation of all marital assets and Harold's extramarital activities. Second, we needed to prevent Harold from hiding or disposing of assets before I could file for divorce. Third, we needed to demonstrate that Harold's conduct had damaged our marriage and affected my financial security. I hired Thomas Brennan, a private investigator Victoria recommended. Thomas was a former police detective with 30 years of experience in surveillance and asset investigation. Within 2 weeks, Thomas had compiled a comprehensive file of Harold's activities. Photos showed Harold and Melody entering hotels, dining at expensive restaurants, and walking hand in hand through downtown. He'd recorded conversations where Harold discussed his plans to start fresh in Florida with Melody once the divorce was finalized. Thomas also uncovered Harold's financial maneuvers. 6 months earlier, Harold had opened a separate business account and had been gradually transferring funds from our joint accounts. He'd purchased a luxury car and titled it under his business name, and he'd been paying for a downtown apartment where he and Melody met regularly. The apartment lease was in Harold's name, only another indication that he'd been planning his exit strategy for months. The private investigator discovered that Harold had been researching divorce lawyers and retirement communities in Florida. His computer search history showed extensive research into community property laws and strategies for protecting business assets during divorce proceedings. He'd even consulted with a financial advisor about restructuring his business to minimize his wife's potential claims. While Thomas gathered evidence, I began protecting our assets under Victoria's guidance. She had advised me of my legal right to access and secure our joint accounts. I transferred half of our savings into a separate account, liquidated our shared investment portfolio, and removed Harold as the beneficiary on my life insurance policy. I also had our real estate appraised. The Victorian house we'd called home for 30 years was now worth $800,000, and our 2 rental properties were valued at an additional $400,000 each. I changed the locks on our safe deposit box and photographed all the contents. The jewelry Harold had given me over the years, including my grandmother's pearl necklace that he'd promised would stay in our family, the stock certificates, and the cash we kept for emergencies. Everything was documented and secured. Victoria helped me understand the full scope of our marital estate. Harold's business, which he'd built from nothing during our marriage, was now valued at nearly $3 million. Our retirement accounts, combined savings and investment properties, brought our total marital assets to over $5 million. Harold's plan to leave me with a modest settlement while keeping the majority of our wealth was not just heartless, it was illegal. Our 55th anniversary fell on a Saturday in June. Harold woke up that morning acting strangely nervous, barely touching the breakfast I'd prepared. Blueberry pancakes, his favorite since our first year of marriage. He kept checking his phone and seemed unable to sit still. "Clara," he said, finally pushing his plate away with the pancakes barely touched. "We need to have an important conversation after dinner tonight." I nodded calmly, though my heart was pounding. I knew exactly what that conversation would entail, thanks to the text messages I'd seen between him and Melody planning his announcement for our anniversary. "Of course, Harold," I replied, refilling his coffee cup. "But first, let's celebrate properly. 55 years deserves recognition. Don't you think I spent the day preparing his favorite meal? Pot roast with Yorkshire pudding, green beans from our garden, and the apple pie his mother had taught me to make during our first year of marriage." Harold seemed surprised that I was going to such effort, especially since he'd been distant and critical for months. He spent most of the day in his office, presumably coordinating his post-dinner plans with Melody. That evening, I set our dining room table with our wedding china and the silver candlesticks that had been a wedding gift from my grandmother. I lit candles and opened a bottle of wine from the collection we'd been saving for special occasions. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was creating a romantic setting for Harold to ask for a divorce. Harold seemed genuinely surprised by the formal setting when he came downstairs. "Clara, this is very nice," he said, though his voice lacked warmth. "You didn't need to go to all this trouble." He barely touched his food and kept glancing at his phone, probably checking for encouraging messages from Melody. I shared memories from our wedding day, the early years in our first apartment, watching David take his first steps in this very dining room. "Remember when Susan lost her first tooth right here at this table?" I asked, passing him the Yorkshire pudding. "You convinced her that the tooth fairy paid extra for teeth lost during family dinners." Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Clara, that's all in the past now," he said, setting down his fork. "People change. We've grown apart over the years. I think we both know this isn't working anymore." I continued eating calmly, savoring what I knew would be my last meal as Harold's wife. "What exactly isn't working, Harold?" I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. He took a deep breath and delivered the speech I knew was coming. I want a divorce, Clara. I've met someone who makes me happy, who appreciates me for who I am now, not who I used to be. His voice gained confidence as he continued, probably remembering Melody's coaching. After 55 years, I deserve to live for myself. Melody understands me. She supports my ambitions and makes me feel alive again. I see, I said, taking a sip of wine. How long have you been planning this? It doesn't matter when it started, Harold replied, pushing back from the table. What matters is that I'm done living a lie. I've been unhappy for years, Clara. You've stopped caring about anything beyond your garden club and book club meetings. We have nothing in common anymore. The accusations stung, even though I'd read variations of them in his messages to Melody. Here was a man who'd built his success on my support, who'd relied on me to manage our home and raise our children while he focused on his career, now claiming I'd become irrelevant to his life. He stood up, straightening his shoulders in a gesture I recognized from his business presentations. I'll be fair in the settlement, he said with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. You'll have enough to live comfortably. The house is too big for you anyway. Harold picked up his phone and car keys. I'm staying at my downtown apartment tonight. My lawyer will be in touch with you next week to work out the details. As he headed toward the front door, I remained seated at our anniversary table, surrounded by the remnants of our last meal together. Harold, I called out, my voice still calm. After everything we've built together, after all the promises we made, this is how you want to end things. He paused in the doorway, but didn't turn around. Sometimes endings are the only way to find new beginnings. Clara. The front door closed behind him with a finality that echoed through our empty house, leaving me alone with 55 years of memories and the satisfaction of knowing that Harold had no idea what was coming next. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in our living room, surrounded by 55 years of shared memories, and waited for morning. At exactly 8 o'clock, I called Victoria Sterling. It's time, I said simply. Harold made his announcement last night just as we expected. Victoria had everything prepared. We'd been ready for this moment for months. She filed the divorce papers that morning, along with an emergency motion to prevent Harold from disposing of any marital assets. The papers included comprehensive documentation of Harold's affair, his attempts to hide money, and his plan to leave me with minimal support while keeping the majority of our marital property. By 10 o'clock, court orders had been served freezing all joint accounts and credit cards. Harold's business accounts were placed under judicial review, pending a complete asset evaluation. The temporary restraining orders prevented him from selling, transferring, or encumbering any property without court approval. The process moved with remarkable speed. Victoria had explained that when one spouse attempts to hide assets or defraud the other, courts tend to act quickly to prevent further financial damage. By noon, temporary restraining orders were in place protecting our home vehicles and business interests. Harold discovered the changed situation when he tried to return home that afternoon, probably to retrieve more clothing and personal items. The locks had been changed, and the security system had been reprogrammed with new codes. A certified letter taped to the front door informed him that all future communication should go through our respective attorneys, and that he was prohibited from entering the marital residence without court permission. When he tried to access the bank accounts to withdraw funds for his planned celebration dinner with Melody, he found every card declined and every account frozen. His business credit cards were similarly restricted. The man who had walked out on our anniversary dinner declaring his independence now couldn't buy lunch without borrowing money. His business operations ground to a halt when he couldn't access company funds to pay employees or suppliers. Payroll was due that Friday, and Harold had no way to meet his obligations. His secretary called me in a panic, not understanding why the company accounts were inaccessible. I referred her to Victoria Sterling's office and suggested she contact Harold's new attorney. Melody's reaction was swift and predictable. Thomas reported that Harold had called her in distress, explaining that his wife had somehow frozen all his accounts and prevented him from accessing his own business. Melody had initially been sympathetic, but when Harold couldn't afford their planned weekend in Chicago and had to ask her to pay for dinner, her enthusiasm for their relationship cooled considerably. Within a week of Harold's financial difficulties becoming apparent, Thomas photographed Melody having lunch with another executive from Harold's company. The man who had seemed so confident about starting a new life suddenly found himself alone and financially powerless. The court proceedings moved through the system with impressive efficiency. Harold's attorney, a general practice lawyer who clearly wasn't prepared for the complexity of our case, attempted to argue that the asset freeze was excessive and punitive. Judge Martinez reviewed our evidence and quickly determined that the restrictions were necessary to preserve marital property. When our case came before the court for its first hearing, Victoria presented our evidence methodically. She had organized everything into clear categories: documentation of Harold's affair, proof of his attempts to hide assets, evidence of his plan to defraud me of marital property, and a comprehensive valuation of our shared assets. Harold's attorney argued for a standard 50-50 division of assets, claiming that Harold's affair was irrelevant to property division and that his business success entitled him to a larger share. But Victoria had documentation that told a different story. Your Honor, Victoria said during our hearing, Mr. Harold didn't just have an affair. He systematically planned to defraud my client of her rightful share of marital property. The evidence shows clear intent to leave Mrs. Clara with insufficient resources while he enjoyed the fruits of their life's work with his girlfriend. She presented Harold's draft emails to divorce attorneys, his secret financial transfers, and his communications with Melody about their plans for a comfortable life in Florida. The court also heard testimony about my contributions to Harold's business success, managing his household, entertaining his clients, and providing the stable home environment that allowed him to focus entirely on building his company. The business evaluation revealed that Sterling Engineering Solutions was worth $2.8 million. Our real estate portfolio, including the Victorian house and rental properties, was appraised at $1.6 million. Our retirement accounts, investment portfolio, and other assets added another $900,000 to the marital estate. Judge Martinez reviewed all the evidence of Harold's infidelity and asset concealment before issuing his ruling. The court finds that Mr. Harold's actions constitute marital misconduct that directly affected the economic circumstances of this marriage. He stated, Mrs. Clara supported her husband's career for 55 years, enabling him to build substantial wealth that he then attempted to hide and claim as his separate property. I was awarded our Victorian home, both rental properties and controlling interest in Harold's business. Harold would receive a minority stake in the company he'd built, but I would control its operations and major decisions. The judge also ordered Harold to pay me $4,000 per month in spousal support for 10 years, given his higher earning capacity and the length of our marriage. The final settlement gave me 70% of our marital assets, reflecting both Harold's misconduct and the court's recognition of my contributions to our shared success. Harold left the courthouse with his attorney looking significantly older than his 74 years. Today, as I sit in my beautiful home that now belongs entirely to me, I can honestly say that I've never been happier. The process of rebuilding my life began immediately after the divorce was finalized. I've renovated the house according to my own taste for the first time in decades. Bright yellow paint in the kitchen, a cozy reading nook by the bay window, and a craft room where Harold's old office used to be. The rose garden is thriving again under the care of Martinez Landscaping, a father and son team who visit twice a month. We've added new varieties that I always wanted, but Harold considered too expensive or impractical. The garden now includes a meditation space with a small fountain where I sit each morning with my coffee and plan my day. I've joined the Riverside Book Club with 8 other women my age who share my love of literature and intellectual conversation. We meet monthly to discuss everything from contemporary fiction to historical biographies, and the discussions are more stimulating than any conversation I'd had with Harold in years. These women have become dear friends who've supported me through this transition and celebrate my independence. My volunteer work at the Sunnydale Animal Shelter has been incredibly rewarding. I spend Tuesday and Thursday mornings socializing rescued dogs and helping with adoption events. The work gives me purpose and has introduced me to other volunteers who share my love of animals. I'm even considering adopting a senior dog who needs a quiet home. Last month, I took a cruise to Alaska with 3 friends from church, Martha, Eleanor, and Joyce. We talked about such a trip for years, but Harold had always found reasons why we couldn't afford it, or the timing wasn't right. Standing on the deck watching glaciers calve into the sea, I felt a freedom I hadn't experienced since I was 18 years old. David and Susan have both told me how proud they are of my strength during this difficult time. They initially worried about how I'd manage alone after so many years of marriage, but they've seen me flourish in ways that surprise us all. My 4 grandchildren love visiting Grandma's castle, as they call my Victorian home. I've turned the spare bedroom into a playroom where they can stay overnight and we can have proper adventures. The rental properties provide steady income that supplements the court-ordered support payments. I've hired a property management company to handle day-to-day operations, but I remain involved in major decisions. The financial security gives me freedom to travel, pursue hobbies, and be generous with my children and grandchildren. Harold is living in a studio apartment across town working part-time as a consultant for his former competitors. The man who once controlled a multi-million-dollar business now depends on the monthly distribution I authorize from the company he built. His income is sufficient for basic needs, but the lifestyle he planned with Melody is no longer possible. Melody left him when his financial problems became clear, and from what I hear through mutual friends, Harold spends most evenings alone. Several former business associates have mentioned seeing him at the diner downtown eating alone and looking much older than his 74 years. He's lost weight, and his always perfect appearance has become somewhat shabby. But I don't take pleasure in his suffering. Holding on to anger would only poison my own happiness, and I've worked too hard to rebuild my life to waste energy on resentment. What I've gained isn't just financial security, it's self-respect and the knowledge that I'm stronger than I ever imagined possible. I've learned that 55 years of marriage doesn't guarantee loyalty, and that sometimes the person you trust most will hurt you the deepest. But knowledge truly is power, and preparation is the best protection against betrayal. I discovered that self-respect means demanding respect from others, even after decades of taking it for granted. Most importantly, I realized that the woman who spent decades building a family and supporting a man's dreams had every right to defend what she'd helped create. Trust should be earned every day, not assumed after decades, and when someone shows you who they really are through their actions, you should believe them and respond accordingly. The divorce taught me that I'd been living for others for so long that I'd forgotten who Clara was when she wasn't being Harold's wife or David and Susan's mother. Rediscovering myself at 77 has been the most unexpected gift of this entire experience. Sometimes, the ending we fear most becomes the beginning we needed all along. Harold thought he was leaving me for happiness, but what he really did was free me to discover who Clara could be when she stopped living for everyone else's dreams and started honoring her own. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to find strength you didn't know you possessed when someone you trusted betrayed that trust? How did you rebuild your life after a devastating disappointment that shook everything you believed about your future? What advice would you give to someone facing their own moment of truth? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, because your story might inspire someone else who's facing their own difficult crossroads right now. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you and reminded you that it's never too late to fight for what you deserve. Subscribe for more real-life stories of resilience, transformation, and the courage to start over when life takes an unexpected turn. And please share this video with anyone who needs to know that their worth isn't determined by someone else's inability to see their value. Thank you for listening to my story today, and remember that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually the beginning of the life you were always meant to live.